Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar focused on corporate PPA structures and legal considerations for long-term PPAs. Thank you, first of all, for being here this morning. My name is Dana Metaxas, and I am the content developer for the Solarplaza Belgium Summit, taking place in Brussels on the 28th of November. And today I will be moderating this session. So before I go on and introduce our speaker of today, let me give you some practical information and a little bit of a background about who we are at Solarplaza. This webinar is somewhat of a jumpstart to our Belgium Summit, and you can find the speaker lineup and the content and information on our website should you be interested in attending. The great news is that if you're attending this webinar right now or are watching it within the next few days, you can get a 15% discount on your event ticket, and our marketing team will provide you with the discount code and some further information on this. We want to make this webinar as interactive as possible, so I'd like to encourage you to send in your questions right from the start, and we will be attending to them after the presentation. You can post all of your questions in the question box on your right-hand side. The webinar recording will become available within 1 to 2 days after this live session. So next, let me give you a bit of a background on who we are in case this is your first webinar with us. Solarplaza was established in 2004. We are based in Rotterdam, but we organize events almost all over the world. So far, we have organized around 200 events in 44 countries worldwide and counting. We are currently connecting a network of 60,000 plus solar PV professionals. And besides our summits, we also provide newsletters, resources, and obviously, as you can see, webinars as well. And besides our events platform, we also opened up a consultancy branch as well as a foundation. So if you're interested in our services and initiatives, I encourage you to check out our website again. And that was all I had to say. And without any further ado, I would like to welcome Stella Mavrommati, Senior Associate at CMS, who will be our speaker of today. Stella, you may switch on your camera. Thank you for being here, and I will let you take it away.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Stella Mavrommati. I'm a lawyer. I'm a senior associate at CMS, which is a law firm. I am based in London, but in the past, I have also worked in Brussels and in Greece. And through my practice, I had an opportunity to work on various PPAs all across Europe for different projects. And yeah, look at all the complexities surrounding those very interesting deals that are very, very prominent right now in Europe. Could we please move on to the next slide? Thank you. So today we're going to talk about PPAs, but we will also talk about a very specific risk that is very relevant for these transactions, and that is change in law. Change in law is something that can affect a number of agreements, including PPAs, because especially when something is intended for the long term, you want to make sure that if the circumstances change, you will be able to adapt the transaction if you need to. So I thought we could start with a small introduction about PPAs. PPAs are power purchase agreements, as I guess most of you know. They are contracts between sellers, which are usually developers of power plants, and buyers. And in the recent years, we've been talking a lot about corporate PPAs. In those transactions on the buyer side, there's a large corporate often, or an industrial. And those corporate PPAs are used as vehicle to green electricity demand across the world. Large corporates and industrials account for almost 2/3 of the world's electricity demand. So if we can green that consumption, well, that's great. And those PPAs connect corporates directly with sellers and developers of green renewable energy plants. So they enter into those agreements usually for 10, 12, or 15 years. You can obviously do it for less, but they tend to be long term. First of all, because the parties are interested in locking in this green electricity for the long run, but also because they are interested in hedging their exposure to volatile electricity prices. So they use those as vehicles to do that. So taking into account that those are for, like I said, 10 or 15 years, what happens when circumstances change, like we said? So when there's a change in law. So change in law is not something new. It's not something that we came across for the first time in PPAs. It's something that you often come across also in infrastructure projects and contracts. So you can also come across these clauses in public-private partnership arrangements, other infrastructure contracts. And it's essentially a relief when a new law that wasn't taken into consideration when the parties entered into the agreement comes into effect. So it's about changes in existing legislation, but also new legislation that might come in during the 10 or 15-year life of the transaction. And the problem with changes in law is that they can expose the project company, especially, to a number of risks. So those changes might mean that the project company will need to incur an additional cost that they didn't expect would apply when they first entered into the agreement. That's an additional capital expenditure. That means that the revenues from the PPA are affected. So what these clauses do is they can be an opener to do price adjustments, to recover costs, or even to get time extensions, or if necessary, even terminate the agreement when there's no other way out. One of the very important things that need to be considered when you're considering a change in law clause is risk allocation. So depending on the type of the risk and the change, and depending on who sits on the other side, risk allocation can be different. So for example, when you enter into a contract with a government entity and you talk to them about change in law, they might be a lot more attuned to undertaking part of that risk, because they're like, well, we're the government. But when there's a private entity opposite you and you're a project developer, they might see some changes in law as the operator's risk. So they might be a little bit more reserved with accepting some changes in law falling within the scope of change in law clauses. So let's talk about the scope of change in law clauses and what types of changes we typically see falling within this mechanism. So the first and probably the easiest one is, well, if there's a change that makes your PPA illegal or unenforceable, well, obviously that's a very significant change in law, and the parties need to sit down and consider what they need to do with this agreement. Nobody wants a party to violate the law. So that's an easy one, and well, I'd say almost always present in change in law clauses. The second one is a variation of the illegality and enforceability change, and that's a change in market design. Electricity markets have evolved to be these complex structures involving the very different sides of the market. In this chart, you can see an overview of how most energy markets are structured across Europe. So you see all those different value chains, and you also see where the PPA sits. So electricity continues to flow throughout those different value chains. It's traded on the wholesale market, it's then sold to suppliers, and then you have a PPA in the mix that can be virtual or physical to sell that power directly from the generator to a home or a business. But that's not normally how the structure works, right? And this structure is regulated by a number of codes and regulations. So when something changes within those codes and it upsets the PPAs, this is obviously a risk that that needs to be addressed carefully in a PPA. So we often see also changes in market design being part of change in law clauses. Another one that comes in sometimes, but not always, is changes in law that causes a change in the commercial balance of the contract. So the first two that we just talked about are usually changes that make somehow wholly or partially the contract illegal or unenforceable. But when there's a change in the commercial balance and the contract becomes more expensive for one party, the question is, what do you do? And this is very often a very heavily negotiated part of change in law clauses. And the parties need to consider whether they are willing to open up themselves to the possibility of changing the contract during its life simply because something new came in, and well, it might be the risk of a party, but it might not be the risk of a party. Market disruption events are also often part of change in law contracts clauses. Those are very forceful and violent and sudden events. They are events like your reference price, so the price at the energy exchange disappearing for some reason. Maybe something went wrong at the energy exchange, the trading activity stops. So stuff like that mainly comes from financial markets. And last but not least, change in tax, which is another big one. Traditionally, we've been considering that change in tax should not be part of change in law clauses. Risk fall where it lies when it comes to change in tax. But recently, I must say that we sometimes see this being requested in transactions. But yeah, traditionally, we consider that change in tax is not part of change in law. It's something completely different. And when a change in tax needs to be factored in, we might even consider making it its own clause rather than bundling it in with the rest of the items that may fall within the scope of a change in law clause. So let's now have a look at the mechanics of how these change in law clauses work. So what happens when either of those events that I just described comes into effect, when there's a change that makes the contract unenforceable or more expensive for a party? So what these clauses usually do is they provide for an opportunity for the party that's affected by the change in law to give notice to the other party and ask it to come to the table and discuss. So they reopen the PPA, and that's mandatory. Like if the affected party asks you to come to the table and discuss, you have to come to the table and discuss. So it's not just, you know, something happening out of good faith purely. It's a contractual obligation. So the parties sit and discuss for a few weeks or months about how they can change the PPA. They agree on amendments or not. And if they don't agree on what amendments need to be made, these clauses usually say that you can refer the matter to an expert who can decide what the appropriate amendment is. And if the expert cannot decide that, or if there is no expert determination provisions in the PPA, then the matter goes to a dispute, and it goes to a court that can decide what can be done and who's at fault, if anyone's unreasonable, etc. So I think that concludes how change in law clauses work broadly. And why don't we have a look at a recent example of a change in law that came into effect in various jurisdictions across the EU that triggered the applicability of change in law clauses, and that was the introduction of price caps during the recent electricity crisis. Energy crisis, excuse me. So during this last 2-year crisis where we saw prices spike all across Europe, one of the things that some countries did, and it was also encouraged by the EU institutions, was to introduce price caps. And how those price caps work? Well, that's shown in the graph that you have in front of you. So normally you have an electricity price, which is this dotted line that you see in the chart. It goes up and down, and that's your reference price. That's the price that applies in the energy exchange. What the PPA seeks to do is stabilize this for the parties. So the parties agree on a strike price, which is the green line that you see in the chart. And well, if the electricity market goes up, goes above this green line, then the generator pays the difference to the buyer. If it goes down, then the buyer pays the difference to the generator. That's a very usual price structure in PPAs that feature a fixed price component. Now the price caps came and they sat on top of this whole structure, and the price cap would be this red line that you see in front of you. And as you can see, it creates a number of questions. So when those measures came out, lots of market players started asking questions. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know whether, especially the bit that sits above the red line and the highest point of the electricity price. The question is, who do I give this to? Do I give it to the government? Or do I give it to my buyer? Because under my PPA, I'm under a contractual obligation to give this to my buyer, but the government is now asking for this amount. So do I need to pay this to both? So you can appreciate this is far from ideal. It affected heavily, especially virtual PPAs. So in some jurisdictions, we saw the regulator being conscious that there are PPAs in the market and that those revenues that are supposed to go to a buyer will need to be excluded, but that often applied for physical PPAs. Virtual PPAs happen in the background. The regulator doesn't necessarily know anything about it. It doesn't go through the usual channels of how electricity travels. It's basically just a contract for difference. It's very similar to the swaps that other players in the finance sector do. So this is when we most recently, I think, saw a lot of those change in law clauses come into life. So some generators who thought they were in a difficult position and they felt that they would have to pay the amount twice, once to the government and a second time to the buyer, they tried to trigger these change in law clauses and say, well, here we have something that clearly changed the rules. We obviously knew nothing about it when we entered it in the PPA, and we need to sit down and see how we can address this so we don't pay this amount twice, once to the government and once to you. Well, the question here is, depending on how your change in law clause is structured, you can't necessarily reopen your PPA when something like this happens. So if all you have is changes that make the contract illegal or unenforceable, well, maybe your hands are tied and you can't really reopen the contract. That doesn't mean, of course, that that you can't, approach your counterparty and ask them to have a reasonable discussion. No one's intention, presumably, is to bankrupt the seller and agree on any changes that need to be made. And this is also, I think, something that we saw in the market. Some people were willing to sit down and discuss this, even though it wasn't necessarily captured by their change in law clause. But I think this is one of the key examples of how change in law clauses can come to life during the life of a transaction. And it's incredibly interesting because, yes, price caps are behind us. They're no longer around. Most countries have phased them out, I believe. But what happens in the future? What happens when there's another energy crisis? Are price caps coming back? And we saw a lot of debate. There's, as some of you may know, there's an electricity reform currently underway at an EU level. And one of the things that were heavily debated were, do we institutionalize caps? Do we introduce price caps in the legislation across the EU? And some people argued that they should be part of the standard legislation. But some people said that it shouldn't, because basically that spooks investors, right? The problem, of course, is that, yes, they agreed eventually not to include price caps in standard legislation, but we all know at this stage that they have the emergency powers to do that if something happens in the future. And one, I think we can also have a look of how other local law or elements can affect change in law clauses, and I think Belgium is an excellent example too of a jurisdiction that features maybe a particularity that's not necessarily apparent in other jurisdictions that can have an impact on change in law clauses. So very recently in Belgium, they codified the concept of hardship and they embedded it in the Belgian civil code. Hardship is a concept that's very similar to what we've been discussing. So hardship is a very exceptional change in circumstances that makes the contract incredibly unfair and unreasonable for a party. And when certain conditions apply, including, for example, yeah, like I said, when it becomes excessively onerous, or when it was something that was unforeseeable at the time that the parties entered into the agreement, a party can invoke hardship, and it works in a very similar way as change in law clauses do. So the parties need to reopen the contract and negotiate agreements. If the parties don't do that, then a court can intervene and do that for them. So hardship is something that's recognized in places like Belgium and France, but for example, in common law jurisdictions, it's not recognized. So in England and Wales, it's not something that's recognized under common law or under New York law. It's those jurisdictions think that the parties are sophisticated parties that can agree whether this is something that they need to do. So they leave it to the freedom of the parties. And the question then becomes, in those jurisdictions like Belgium and France, can you negotiate hardship? What does this mean for your usual change in law? Because I've done PPAs in Belgium, and I've seen your usual change in law clauses that you see all across Europe. And then the question is, how does this interact with this concept that's regulated under local law? Does this mean that any of the elements that I have in my change in law clause are not enforceable in this jurisdiction because this concept exists under law? To what extent can I negotiate the hardship? Can I just switch it off for one of the parties and then leave it on for the other parties? Well, maybe not. Maybe a judge will decide that this is unfair. So all those are things that you need to consider when you work in a jurisdiction that has hardship as a concept recognized under law. And yeah, consider how you need to adjust your usual change in law clause, because I appreciate that many market players have standard forms, standard PPAs that they use in different jurisdictions, but you always need to think about local law elements and whether you need to adapt what you have in your usual contracts in other jurisdictions, because there's a particularity in this specific market. So yeah, I think that concludes my presentation about the risk of change in law and how this is addressed in PPAs. I would be very happy to answer any questions you may have. Do feel free to send them in. I think we already have some questions that came in from some of you. So the first one is, sorry.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much, Stella, for a great presentation. I think it was really thorough and really well done. Indeed, we still have a few minutes to get to a few questions we have from the audience. So let's see what we have so far. So the first question we had is, how come the yearly total volume of PPAs is known? Is there a mandatory database register for all PPAs?
So that's a very interesting question, and I think you might be referring to the first slide that was shown in my presentation that showed the deal-making activity across Europe. So that slide comes from it doesn't come from an official source. It's coming from Standard & Poor's Global Commodity Insights. There is no mandatory database at this stage for PPAs, but it is something that is being considered by the EU as something that might help give visibility to these deal-making activities. Some jurisdictions may be more willing than others to adopt such databases, to offer transparency, to possibly give an opportunity to different sides of the market to participate in PPAs, because I think one of the difficulties that a lot of people have is that how do I find out about the good projects, and how do I find a project to conclude a PPA? It's a very legitimate question. Now, whether we achieve this through a database, I'm not sure. I think there are quite a few things that we will need to consider if we decide to go for databases that I'm not entirely sure have been necessarily thought through. So what are your, does this change, for example, the treatment of this instrument as a, I don't know, as a financial instrument? Because if those databases are very similar to your exchanges, well, obviously you have probably very different obligations when you trade on an organized market than when you do a bilateral contract with a counterparty. So yeah, to answer your question, it's not coming from an official government source. My slide is coming from word of mouth and what some key players hear that happens in the market.
Thank you. We do have quite a few questions coming in from the audience right now. The next one is, I heard PPA activity in Europe was still muted this year following the volatility last year. Are you seeing any increase in PPA activity recently?
So we saw a spike probably in 2021 as the slide shown itself. In 2022, the trend continued, and we may have had, maybe it's worth going to that, back to that slide. Oh, sorry. Anyway, so we may have seen a slight reduction in 2022, but that was mostly due to a reduction in utility demand for PPAs. I think the interest in corporate PPAs goes on strong, and the slide that I was showing shows lower volumes in 2023 because the data is up to April 2023, so it's not a whole year. But from what we see in the market and what others report as well, it seems like the appetite for PPAs is very similar to what we saw in 2022. So it didn't necessarily go down significantly, but there obviously is some reservation in the market.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. The next question is, when the clause talks about commercial balance being changed, does that usually imply that one person's loss is another's gain, or is it usual to see the clauses invoked when one person's costs go up?
Yes, so the idea is that this is triggered when one person's costs go up, but then those costs go up and they are somehow shared between the parties. So there's always this battle that you have, because it ends up like one of the parties is going to end up being hurt somehow by this change. Because take, for example, price caps, right? A buyer could approach this by saying, it's not my problem, it's not my risk, it's not something that the regulator imposes on me, it's money that the regulator asks from the project company. So I can just sit down, enjoy the benefits that I get from the PPA, and you decide, project company, what you do with your regulator, what you do with these additional amounts that they ask for you. If we agree, if the buyer and the seller agree to change the contract, obviously the buyer then enjoys a lesser benefit compared to what it would have gained if it wasn't for the change in the contract following the change in law. So it ends up like one of the parties ends up being a little bit hurt because it considers it fair to share a risk proportionately with the other party.
Mm-hmm. And one more question is, what will be the long-term effect of, or long-term legal effect of storage solutions on PPAs?
So we start to see, we do start to see different types of PPAs recently in the market. So we do start to see PPAs covering different types of assets. So also storage, along with generation plan. We also see hydrogen coming in the mix. So long-term solutions can definitely be very, storage solutions can definitely be, I think, very beneficial for PPAs, because think of industrials, for example, as buyers. Shaping is very important to them. They want to make sure that they can get electricity when they need it. So storage can offer a solution in the sense that you cannot guarantee when the sun's going to shine and when the wind's going to blow. But if you can couple this with a storage solution and you can make sure that you will have stable supply from that power plant, well, that obviously makes the offering much more appealing to a buyer.
Thank you. And I think we have one last question for now. Could you please comment on the difference between on-site and off-site PPAs? And if on-site PPAs are affected by price caps since they don't participate in energy markets when the project size is below, for example, 3 megawatt.
Mm-hmm. So on-site PPAs, meaning PPAs for assets that are behind the meter, are maybe less affected by price caps, to the extent that what price caps sought to do is cap the spikes in electricity prices for electricity traded on energy exchanges. To the extent that this electricity does not go through an energy exchange, obviously this price cap wouldn't apply. The issue is that you can't always choose on-site over off-site. There are various commercial considerations around whether you can you can do that. So it's a reality that the parties have to face. It's not necessarily something that they can decide. But yeah, I think that on-site PPAs are less affected by price caps. But there are issues that might also affect not just price caps. There are other regulations that might affect on-site PPAs in the future. So what if the regulator decides, for example, that there's a levy that currently applies to off-site PPAs and they will apply to on-site as well? And all of a sudden, something that seemed very appealing in the past becomes more costly, and usually levies are passed on to the buyer, so it becomes more expensive to the buyer. So change in law clauses, I think, are equally relevant to both structures.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Stella. Unfortunately, this was all the time that we had today for this webinar. Of course, if there should be any other questions coming in from the audience, I will make sure to pass them on to you, and we can still answer them after this in the next few days. Once again, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a great presentation. And also a big thank you to our audience for attending this webinar today. If you would like to hear more about PPA structures or in general what's going on in the Belgian market, as I said in the beginning, we will host a full day event on November 28th. And should you be interested in buying a ticket, by attending this webinar, you are eligible for a 15% discount on your ticket. And our marketing team will share some more information with you on this. And the discount will be applicable from today until 1 week from today. Yeah, for any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. As I said, I will pass them on to Stella. and I wish you a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Thanks very much.